Hi everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we are going to discuss few questions related to pedigree analysis. So let's begin. The first question is, what kind of inheritance is indicative in the pedigree chart shown below? The first option is Y-linked inheritance. Now we know that Y-linked inheritance occurs for traits which are encoded by genes present on the Y chromosome. We also know that males have one X chromosome and one Y chromosome, whereas females have two X chromosomes. So basically, females do not express Y-linked traits, only males express them. Here we can see that the female is getting the trait or she is affected. That means that the inheritance is not Y-linked. Let's move over to the next option, that is X-linked dominant. Here X-linked stands for that the trait is encoded by a gene present on the X chromosome. And dominant means that one allele encoding that particular phenotype is sufficient for the expression of phenotype. In other words, homozygous dominant as well as heterozygous females would express the phenotype. If the mutation is carried on both the X chromosomes, or if it is carried at least on one X chromosome of the female, then she is going to be affected. If the mutation is carried on none of her X chromosomes, that is in a homozygous recessive condition, the phenotype would not be affected. In case of males, since males only have a single X chromosome, if that particular X chromosome carries the mutation, then the male would be affected. So this male would be affected. But a male with a normal X chromosome or one that does not carry the mutation would not express the phenotype. Now, how we can use this information to come to a conclusion if the inheritance is X-linked dominant or not? For that, I want you to look at the affected male. So let's assume that this affected male who carried the mutation on the X chromosome mated with a normal female. That means she did not carry the mutation on any of her X chromosomes, so she was unaffected. They had a daughter, and we know that the father passes on his X chromosome to the daughter, and the mother also passes on her X chromosome, such that this daughter has this X chromosome coming from the father. Now, the daughter is obviously going to be affected because the trait is showing X-linked dominant inheritance. And this would be applicable for all the other daughters that come a result of this mating. In other words, an affected father would always give rise to an affected daughter if the trait is X-linked dominant. Here we can see that this father is affected, but he is not passing the trait to his daughter. Likewise, this father is affected, but he is not passing the trait to his daughter. Therefore, the trait cannot be X-linked dominant. The third option is X-linked recessive. Again, the term X-linked stands for that the trait is encoded by gene present on the X chromosome. And recessive term here means that the mutation now needs to be present on both X chromosomes of the female in order for her to show the phenotype. The trait would be expressed only in a homozygous recessive condition. In other words, only this female X dash X dash who carries the mutation on both of her X chromosomes is going to express the disease. And again, for males, they need to carry the mutation on their X chromosome for them to express the disease. Now here, how can we use this information to come to a conclusion if the inheritance is X-linked recessive? For that, I want you to take an affected female, that means she has the mutation on both of her X chromosomes, and mate it with a normal man. That means the man does not carry a mutation on his X chromosome. If say they have a son, then the man is going to pass his Y chromosome to the son and the woman is going to pass her X chromosome to the son. Now, doesn't matter which X chromosome comes to the son, it is always going to bear the mutation, making the son affected himself. In other words, we can say that if the inheritance is X-linked recessive, then an affected mother would always give rise to affected sons. Over here, we can see that this mother is affected, but her son is not affected. Therefore, we can say that the inheritance is not X-linked recessive. The only option left is autosomal dominant, which is the correct option. But also, let's check whether the genotypes fit in with our result. For that, remember that autosomal traits are the ones which are encoded by genes present on autosomes. And autosomes are the same in males and females. So they do not have any sex-linked inheritance. And here also the dominant term means that the trait would be expressed in homozygous dominant as well as heterozygous individuals. So let's quickly write down the genotypes for these individuals. Now we know that all of the individuals which are not affected are homozygous recessive because that is the only way they would not be affected. So I'll quickly write down their genotype. Now let's talk about these children. Now since these children are affected themselves but they are getting a small allele from their mother nonetheless, therefore they are all heterozygotes. So this daughter and this son, they are both heterozygous individuals. What about their father then? Their father can be a homozygous individual. That means he can be homozygous dominant or he can be a heterozygous individual. We cannot really be sure about that, but we know this for sure that he has at least one capital A allele, or in other words, he has at least one dominant allele because that is the only way he can produce a diseased phenotype or an affected phenotype. Then what about this particular man? Now since the woman mating with the man produces unaffected children, therefore the man should also be heterozygous. These two sons are also then heterozygous because they're always going to get the recessive allele from their mother. So the genotypes really fit in with the notion that the inheritance is autosomal dominant. So we are sure that the inheritance of the trait is autosomal dominant. The second question is, a pedigree of an inheritable disease is shown below, and they have also given us the key over here. The first option is X-linked dominant. Now I've just told you that to look if a trait is X-linked dominant, you just need to see at the father. If the father is affected, he is going to pass it on to all of his daughters. Here we can see the father is affected, but none of his daughters are affected. That means that the trait is not X-linked dominant. What about the other option, B option, X-linked recessive or Y-linked? Now, if you look at the Y-linked part, then you can see that the father is affected. He passed on the trait to both of his sons. Then the sons passed on the trait to all of their sons. So yes, the inheritance can be Y-linked. Also, no female is affected. So we can say that the inheritance is Y-linked. But what about the X-linked recessive? Can it be X-linked recessive? For that, let's try and write down the genotypes of all the individuals in this pedigree. If the trait is X-linked recessive, then that means that all of these affected males are carrying the mutation on their X chromosome. So I'm going to write down their genotype real quick. Now we look at the mother. The mother is not expressing the phenotype, but she is passing an affected X chromosome to the son. Therefore, she must have one X chromosome with the mutation and a normal X chromosome. That means that she is heterozygous. Now remember, in X-linked recessive or autosomal recessive traits, heterozygous individuals are called carriers. Carriers do not express the diseased phenotype, but they do carry the mutation such that they are capable of passing it on to their offsprings, just like we have seen in this particular example. The female was not herself affected, but she passed on the disease to her son, and actually to both of her sons by some chance. Then what would happen to these two daughters? Obviously, these two daughters receive the X chromosome from the father and the X chromosome from the mother, but here you can see that they do not express the phenotype. That means that somehow both of them received the normal X chromosome from the mother, making them carriers and not expressing the diseased phenotype. What about these portions of the pedigree? It is possible that somehow these men ended up marrying carrier women themselves, because of which the sons that they had were carrying the mutation. That's possible if the mothers transferred their affected X chromosomes to the son. And this daughter is again a carrier because she does not express the diseased phenotype. Likewise, we can write the genotypes for these individuals too. So over here, you can see that everything has been a very chance event. I mean, what are the odds that a person who is affected married a carrier and somehow both of his sons got the affected X chromosome, who themselves ended up marrying carriers and somehow all their sons also ended up getting the affected X chromosome. So even though the chances of all of this happening is quite less, but we cannot really neglect it. So it's better to go for B option, that is X-linked recessive or Y-linked, instead of going with only Y-linked or only X-linked recessive. This much of information is not sufficient for us to comment on whether it is X-linked recessive or Y-linked. At this point, it could be either. Let's move on to the third question that says a pedigree of an inheritable disease is shown below. Here, they have provided us the carriers with dashes, which has made our task much more easier because the first thing that it tells us is that this is not a dominant inheritance trait. Simply because if a trait is of dominant inheritance, then no carriers can exist. Recall that carriers are heterozygous individuals who do not express the trait themselves but can pass it on to the children. In dominant inheritance diseases, heterozygous individuals also express the trait. Therefore, carriers can only exist in traits which have a recessive type of inheritance. Therefore, we automatically cut option A and option B. Let's look at the third option, which is X-linked recessive. Now, we know that these are the carrier females, so we can quickly write down their genotype because we know that all of them are going to have one X chromosome which is carrying the mutation and one X chromosome which does not have the mutation. Now, we also know that this son is affected, so he also has a mutation on his X chromosome. Now, notice how the pedigree does not have any carrier males. That makes us think about this, that maybe the trait is X-linked recessive, because when we talk about X-linked recessive diseases, females can be carriers but males cannot be. Males only have one X chromosome, and if that carries the mutation, then they would be affected. However, in autosomal recessive traits, both males and females can actually be carriers. But right now, we cannot be really sure about it because just as we have seen in the previous question, chance events can always happen. Going back to our assumption that this trait is X-linked recessive inheritance showing trait, then the father would be not affected, so he is going to have a normal X chromosome. Then this son is also not affected, so he is XY, and this daughter is also not affected, but she is not a carrier. So basically for all of these squares or circles which do not have any color or which do not have any dashed lines, I'm going to quickly write their genotypes. Now over here, if you see that the genotypes are actually matching with the inheritance pattern, therefore we can say that the trait is X-linked recessive. But let's also check whether it can be autosomal recessive or not, just for our own satisfaction. For that, all I want you to do is look at these two parents and their affected son, that is this son. Now, since the mother is a carrier, that means that she is heterozygous if the trait is autosomal recessive. And since the father is not affected, nor he is a carrier, therefore he has to be homozygous dominant. If he was heterozygous, then he should have been shown as a carrier too. Now tell me, how can this mating give rise to an affected son? For the son to be affected, he has to inherit both recessive alleles from the parents. The recessive allele can come from the mother, but the father in no way can give him the recessive allele. Therefore, this is indicative of the fact that it is not an autosomal recessive inheritance trait. The answer is the X-linked recessive. Let's move on to the next question. The trait shown in the above pedigree is, the first option is X-linked recessive trait. For that, you need to look at this father. Now see that the father is not himself affected, but he is passing on the trait to the daughter. Remember that if the trait is X-linked recessive, then the daughter should have the mutation on both of her X chromosomes. Well, she can get one affected X chromosome from her mother in case the mother was a carrier herself. But what about the other X chromosome? It has to come from the father, and since the father is not affected himself, therefore this cannot be X-linked recessive trait. The second option is autosomal recessive trait. That means that if the trait is autosomal recessive, then all of the affected individuals are actually autosomal recessive genotypes. So I'll quickly write down their genotypes. Alright, as you can see, all of the sons here and all of these children are all homozygous recessive. Now what about this mother then? Obviously, she is not affected, but she is passing on the small a allele to the sons. That means that she is heterozygous. Likewise, for this daughter, she is also heterozygous. And if she mates with a man who is heterozygous himself, then somehow if all of their children ended up getting these small a alleles from the parents, then all of them can be affected. So the genotype does fit in, and therefore we can say that it is autosomal recessive. But also let's look at the other two options and see why it cannot be Y-linked and why it cannot be X-linked dominant. For Y-linked, the first giveaway is this female, so obviously we cut it off. For X-linked dominant, you see how this father is affected, but he does not pass it on to the daughter. Since the father is affected, therefore his X chromosome should have the mutation, and since that goes into the daughter, therefore she should also have been affected. but since she is not affected, therefore the trait can also not be X-linked dominant. Let's move on to the next question. The following is the inheritance pattern of a trait under observation. Number first is the trait often skips a generation. Now ask yourself this question. If a trait is autosomal dominant or sex-linked dominant, in other words, if the trait is dominant, then would it skip generation? Or, in other words, can unaffected parents give rise to affected children? If that seems too confusing to you, then let me make a pedigree. So suppose this is a normal female and this is a normal man and they both mate to give rise to two children, a female and a male. Both of them were affected. Now let's say that the trait is autosomal dominant. Since the parents are not carrying the disease themselves, therefore they are homozygous recessive. If the parents are homozygous recessive, then how can they pass it on to their children? For the children to express the diseased phenotype, they have to be at least heterozygous. But where is this dominant allele coming from? Therefore, we say that the trait, if autosomal dominant or if sex-linked dominant, can never skip generations. Therefore, we cut these two options right away because as we can see, the trait is often skipping a generation. The second observation is that the number of affected males and females is almost equal. Now we are looking at a number of different pedigrees from different families for the same trait, and we observe that number of males and females which are affected almost is equal. This tells us that the trait is most likely to be autosomal, simply because in sex-linked traits, since males have only a single X chromosome and females have two X chromosomes, therefore males are more likely to express the diseased phenotype. Think about this. Females can be carriers for sex-linked recessive or X-linked recessive traits, right? Here, sex-linked really means X-linked. Males cannot really be carriers. Therefore, if the male inherits the X chromosome carrying the mutation, he would be expressing the phenotype. But if the female has at least one normal X chromosome, then she won't. The end result is that the number of males expressing the phenotype or the number of males expressing the disease are more on average than the number of females, because females can be carriers hiding the X chromosome with the mutation but not themselves expressing the phenotype. Therefore, if the number of affected males and females is almost equal, then we can say that the trait is most likely to be autosomal recessive. The third observation is that the trait is often found in pedigrees with consanguineous marriages. Consanguineous marriages are marriages between siblings or between members of the same family, for example, between cousins. So, if two heterozygous siblings marry and they have children, then the children might receive only the recessive alleles, making them affected. Therefore, the most likely answer over here is autosomal recessive. Alright guys, this is it for this video. I'm going to be making more videos wherein we discuss more pedigree analysis related questions. So please make sure to check them out in the description box. Let's meet again in the next video. Till then, take care and stay safe.